You're watching Euronews Tonight. I'm Mariam Zadi, and these are the headlines this hour. The deadliest attack on civilians so far. Ukraine says the death toll from a Russian airstrike on a theatre in Mariupol now stands at 300. The US and the EU announce a new energy task force and a gas supply deal in a bid to help Europe reduce its reliance on Russian energy. Meanwhile, US President Joe Biden lands in Poland, now home to more than 2 million Ukrainian refugees.
And here in the Cube, we take a closer look at a new EU law that could rein in the powers of big tech companies.
Good evening. Local officials in the Ukrainian city of Mariupol say that as many as 300 people were killed in the March 16th bombing of a theatre where hundreds of civilians were seeking shelter. Russia has denied responsibility for the airstrike, which hit the building despite the word children being written in large white letters outside the theatre. If the death toll is confirmed, it would be the deadliest known attack on civilians since the start of the war 1 month ago. Ukraine is still struggling to evacuate thousands of people who remain trapped in the besieged port city. Well, for more now on the latest on the ground in Ukraine, let's now cross over to our international correspondent, Annelies Borchers. Annelies, good to see you as always. So let's start then with Mariupol. The city is almost destroyed. People are facing starvation. We now know that possibly up to 300 people have been killed in that strike on that theatre. Is there any safe passage for people to actually leave the city?
Well, according to Ukrainian authorities, they were able to evacuate some 35 families out of Mariupol today. We also understand that some 2,000 people were rescued from the city yesterday. But local authorities say they are struggling to get any kind of help, any kind of aid in. A couple of aid trucks and a fuel truck remain stuck outside the city at a Russian checkpoint, unable to get in. And that is what authorities say is transforming conditions inside the city, making those conditions, living conditions, absolutely dire. We spoke to a resident of Mariupol who fled the city at the start of the war, but went back in to try and rescue his mother-in-law after multiple attempts to get her out through these humanitarian corridors failed. And this is what he saw.
It looked like hell. 90% of the buildings were hit. Half of them were like burned, and then there were a lot of dogs in the street. Like you could see they are roaming around in search for food, and there were piles of trash. I saw like 2 bodies. One was covered, and the other was the guy who they just laid in the street, and explosions all the time, and planes are flying in the skies. I felt like I was in a game or something, like it was like a computer game or something, and then I cannot still believe that it happened.
Victor is not this man's real name. He doesn't want to be identified because he is afraid of not being able to access some of these Russian-controlled territories over the next few weeks. He says he wants to continue helping people on the other side. And as for Mariupol, Victor doesn't believe it is possible for the city to be rebuilt.
Now, Annelies, we know that heavy fighting, of course, continues, but Ukraine says it has retaken key towns close to the capital, Kyiv. Is it then winning ground from Russian forces?
Well, Mariam, that is very difficult to confirm at this stage. We do understand that the Pentagon saw intelligence pointing out to the fact that Russian troops were pushed back some 35 kilometers east of Kyiv, but those suburbs to the north of Kyiv, including Irpin, Bucha and Hostomel, where Ukrainian soldiers had been trying to encircle Russian positions, well, there the fighting continues. What we learned a couple of moments ago that sounded very interesting is that Russia said that the first phase of this military operation it launched here in Ukraine on February 24th has been achieved, is now ended. The authorities in Moscow saying that they have been able to reduce the combat capabilities of the Ukrainian army and that Russian troops will now focus on securing, quote unquote, the independence of the Donbass. The Donbass is that part of Ukrainian territory in the east of the country that has been the subject of an 8-year war between Ukrainian soldiers and Russian-backed separatists. Whether that actually means something and whether that indicates that Russia will scale back, it's anyone's guess at this stage. What we also know is that on the diplomatic front, things don't sound too good. That statement by the Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan that the two sides, Ukraine and Russia, would be nearing an agreement was actually dismissed by the Ukrainian Foreign Affairs Minister, who said Ukraine has a very strong position and is not going to give up on any of its requirements, including, of course, territorial integrity and security guarantees from NATO countries that they will not suffer another aggression by Russia anytime soon.
Okay, Annelies, thank you for giving us that update from, the ground realities in Ukraine. Thank you so much. Okay, well, the US and EU have agreed a major deal on natural gas aimed at reducing Europe's reliance on Russian energy. US President Joe Biden and EU Commission Chief Ursula von der Leyen announced the news at a joint press conference in Brussels. Now, Washington and its partners are set to increase gas exports to Europe, starting with an additional 15 billion cubic meters this year. Europe currently depends on Moscow for 40% of its total gas supply, a situation von der Leyen says is no longer tenable.
As you know, we aim to reduce this dependency on Russian fossil fuels and to get rid of it. And this can only be achieved through, of course, first of all, investment in renewables, but also through additional gas supplies, including LNG deliveries. So we want, as Europeans, to diversify away from Russia towards suppliers that we trust, that are friends, and that are reliable.
Our correspondent Shona Murray now joins us from day 2 of this summit in Brussels. Shona, good to see you there at the summit. I'm sure you've been having a very long day, as always. So we had this big expected announcement from the summit itself, the US to supply the EU with liquid natural gas. But how far does this then go to plug that gap for the EU?
Well, the first or initial announcement is for 15 billion cubic meters of liquefied natural gas. That adds on to 22 billion meters, and that's for the first year of 2022. After that, they hope to increase it to 50 billion cubic meters plus 22, which is 72. Now, so that is quite a large jump in terms of what the US is delivering to the EU. What the EU imports from Russia is normally about 150 billion cubic meters. So it doesn't replace fully what the EU imports from Russia, but it does go some of the way. And as we heard there from Ursula von der Leyen, this is obviously a much more reliable source of gas because, of course, it's unclear the relationship with the EU and Russia for the foreseeable future. There's even concerns if the EU doesn't sanction Russia that Vladimir Putin could turn off the taps anyway. So this is seen as a positive step forward to move the EU away from its reliance on Russian energy.
And Shona, what's the mood then in Brussels regarding this new EU-US partnership with relation to Russia? Are people convinced?
I think the past sort of 48 hours have been strengthening the partnership, resuscitating the partnership between the EU and the US after 4 years of Donald Trump. I think the West is much more unified when it comes to obviously targeting and sanctioning Russia, and the EU's position is that they're thankful that Joe Biden is in the White House. And the discussions for this LNG proposal, this new deal, have been underway for several months because the EU has known it's had to end the reliance on Russian gas. So I think it's a positive thing that this has been resolved. The question is for how long will it last? The question remains, will there be a new president in the White House in 2024, and can the EU continue to rely on America? Joe Biden says that is the case, that the transatlantic relationship is much stronger now as a result of this situation with Russia. And the EU and the US and the rest of the Western alliance are really going to start focusing on other countries that are trying to circumvent sanctions around Russia, like China, like India, in order to ensure that they pay their way as well.
Okay, Shona Murray in Brussels, thank you so much for that update from the EU summit, and I hope you do get some sleep. OK, well, after leaving Brussels, President Joe Biden headed to Poland for a 2-day visit. Now, on arrival, he visited US soldiers from the 82nd Airborne Division, based near the Ukrainian border. Before leaving for Warsaw and talks with his Polish counterpart, Andrzej Duda, Biden reminded the troops of why they're there.
The single most important thing that we can do from the outset is keep the democracies united in our opposition and our effort to curtail the devastation that is occurring at the hands of a man who, I quite frankly, think is a war criminal. And I think it will meet the legal definition of that as well.
There are almost 6.6 million internally displaced people in Ukraine. Many have moved to towns and cities close to the borders of neighbouring countries where they can escape the major conflict zones. Louise Miner reports now on how some families are surviving in one such area on the border with Hungary. Take a look.
At first glance, there's no sign of war in Berov in Ukraine. Things look pretty normal. But many of the children you see here playing in the town's main square were recently living in Kharkiv, Mykolaiv or Mariupol. Their families have fled the fighting in search for peace near the Hungarian border. Many are now living in schools and dormitories, like these ones. Ophelia and her daughter came from Kyiv and hope to survive the war here, rather than in another neighbouring country.
We don't want to go abroad in any way. We want to wait until the war is over, and then we want to return home.
Children from conflict zones are treated by a psychologist, and they have art lessons. Their artwork is then sent to the soldiers fighting on the front lines. The session helps them to process the events of the past few weeks.
Some children, unfortunately, are unable to communicate after the terrible events. I don't even know what they went through.
There have been several air raids in Berov recently, but not even one bombing, so the locals don't bother with sirens anymore. However, schools have switched to distance learning.
What I think is most defining is the uncertainty. We don't know if the war will arrive here or not, and if it does, when, and then what to do.
Locals say at least a quarter of the town's Hungarian community has already moved to Hungary. Many people don't fear the fighting, but instead they fear being made conscripts. Louise Miner, Euronews.
Western leaders are warning that the use of chemical weapons by Russia in Ukraine is a very real threat. Speaking after a NATO summit yesterday, President Joe Biden said the security alliance would respond if Moscow deploys this type of warfare. Well, for more on this, Hamish de Breton Gordon, a chemical and biological weapons expert, joins us now. Mr. de Breton Gordon, thank you so much for being on the programme. So we've heard these warnings from the US, from NATO. How real is this threat then that President Putin could use chemical weapons on Ukraine?
I think it's a very real threat indeed. I've seen the Russians at close quarters in Syria for the last 6 years. And when they have got bogged down in fighting in towns and cities, they've escalated. And with their Syrian partners, the Syrian regime, they have resorted to chemical weapons, which proved hugely effective. The 4-year siege of Aleppo was broken in just 13 days of using chlorine barrel bombs. So I think now that they appear to be bogged down in a lot of towns and cities, and even on the retreat, it strikes me that Putin has two options. Option one, he sues for peace and ceasefires, and option two, he escalates. And I agree with President Biden that could well include chemical weapons. And of course, we must avoid that at all costs, because it's only the civilians who will suffer at those hands, because I expect most of the soldiers have gas masks and other protective equipment.
What about the claims that we're hearing from the Ukrainian President Zelensky, who has, of course, accused Putin of using phosphorus bombs?
Yes, I've seen those claims, and they look pretty realistic to me. Again, we've seen phosphorus used frequently in the Syrian campaign, and also more recently in the conflict in North Africa and Ethiopia and Eritrea. It can be very effective as an incendiary weapon, setting buildings and towns on fire, which again is this is a war crime. Unfortunately, white phosphorus is slightly ambiguous. It is legal for armies to use it for illumination at night or smoke screens, but using it to set fire to buildings it is illegal under the Geneva Convention and the rules of war.
OK, well, let's leave those claims aside. Now, we do know that NATO and the US have both said that should Putin use chemical weapons, that they would respond. What does that response then look like?
Well, I think President Biden chose his words very carefully yesterday. There are two responses I expect NATO's looking at. First of all, if toxic industrial chemicals like chlorine or ammonia are used, which is suggested in the Russian false flag accusations, these would be very deniable because there is lots of chlorine in Ukraine. I think if these weapons were used, I expect NATO would further arm the Ukrainian military and further sanction Russia. However, if chemical warfare agents, these are chemicals that are specifically designed to kill as many people as possible, and these are things like Novichok, which is a nerve agent. I'm talking to you from Salisbury in the UK, where the Russians had a chemical attack 4 years ago. If these weapons are used, which could kill tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people, I expect that NATO would react as it did when nerve agents were used in Syria and strike some key Russian assets. But hopefully we're a long way from that. The last thing we need is a conflict between NATO and Russia. I would hope
we definitely don't need that. Mr. Hamish de Breton-Gordon, we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you so much for that analysis of the situation, the possibility of chemical weapons being used by Russia on Ukraine. Thank you so much. The EU has unveiled new laws targeting big tech companies in an effort to level the playing field in the digital world. Ministers say it's the Digital Markets Act is the most important economic regulation in recent decades. Well, let's find out more from Matthew and our team in the Cube. Matthew?
Well, this is certainly a landmark when it comes to digital regulation around the world, and it places the European Union at the forefront. The Executive Vice President of the European Commission, Margrethe Vestager, said on Twitter that she was so happy that negotiators from the European Parliament and the European Council had backed her proposals. She even shared a video on Twitter of politicians celebrating when they had approved the new Digital Markets Act. But exactly why are EU officials celebrating? Well, this new law will allow them to focus specifically on targeting big tech companies, some giants in the industry, the likes of Google, Amazon, Apple, Meta and Microsoft. The Digital Markets Act will allow the EU to take a more proactive role and try and rein in some of the market dominance that these companies enjoy. Currently, the EU rules on e-commerce have not been updated for around 20 years, and of course, in that time, the internet has changed and developed dramatically. If one of these companies is currently found to have abused their market position and violated competition laws, then it is currently an antitrust authority that launches an investigation. But the EU has long lamented that that is a long-winded process that doesn't always result in an effective remedy or fine. All of this then is going to change with the new Digital Markets Act. And a lot of the words that EU officials have been using are the words fair and open. The EU now is going to have an ability to oversee when big tech companies take control of smaller innovations and businesses. And Mariam, any company who is found to violate this new Digital Markets Act, well, they're going to face a fine of 10% of their global sales if they do.
And so, Matthew, what kind of changes are companies then going to have to enforce, and how is this then going to affect consumers?
Well, it's all about supporting local startups and tech companies. Those big companies that I mentioned, the likes of Google and Apple, they're not going to be able to favour their own pre-installed products or services. For example, if you've got an Apple device, you will have the option to delete Apple-owned apps that are listed as mandatory. Similarly, if you've got a Google phone, you'll now be able to download and use an alternative browser or search engine. You won't be tied to the one that was installed on your device when you bought it. And the Digital Markets Act is also going to ensure something known as the interoperability of messaging services, allowing people to send a message on WhatsApp to other users on smaller, competitive platforms like Signal. Unsurprisingly, Mariam, big tech companies have voiced their concerns about this new proposal. But now that it's been approved by negotiators, the Digital Markets Act is going to the European Parliament and ministers from member states for a vote. And if it passes that, it could come into effect in January 2023.
OK, Matthew, thank you for that update on big tech. Always good to know. Now, the sanctions imposed on Russia are having an impact on the economic stability of Georgia. Family members working in Moscow have been sending money back to their relatives, but now it's been a real struggle to help with finances. Richard Cady reports.
Thousands of Georgian citizens used to receive financial assistance from their relatives in Russia as migrant workers. But economic sanctions imposed on Russia following their invasion of Ukraine have made such transactions harder to make, leaving some family members with financial difficulties.
My relatives from Moscow used to send me money every month. Both the transfer and withdrawal were easy. Money was credited to the account through the app. Then I used to withdraw it from the ATM. Now they can only send Russian rubles. It makes no sense and the rate is low. The dollar has risen sharply in Russia. Some banks in Georgia have even suspended this service. If they send currency in dollars, it takes a lot of effort to get the money.
Payments make up 13% of Georgia's GDP. In 2021, Russia was top of the rating of money transfers to Georgia as per the National Bank. It was followed by Italy and the USA in second and third place, respectively. Economists in Georgia believe that the Georgian economy will be affected in this regard too.
A decrease in money transfers may impose problems for some citizens. And indeed, banks may also be partly affected. Though the institutions do not face any real threat at this time, I can say this with certainty.
According to the National Bank of Georgia, money transfers will not completely stop, but they will be considerably reduced. This will be an additional burden for the Georgian economy, already suffering because of the war. Richard Cady, Euronews.
OK, well, that's it for tonight. Thank you for watching Euronews Tonight. Take care. Bye-bye.